Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is focused on presidents and the Panama Canal. The United States had an interest in connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean going back to the early 19th century, but it was really the middle part of that century, after the Mexican War, when the United States secured all this additional land, now truly a transcontinental nation, no transcontinental railroad yet. It really wanted to improve communication and transportation between the East Coast and the West Coast. So for that, they looked to Central America, and the presidency of Zachary Taylor and his administration actually negotiated a treaty with the nation of Nicaragua. The deal was the United States would build and operate a canal. It would be open to all international traffic. The Nicaraguans would retain sovereignty over that strip of land. The problem wasn't the Nicaraguans. The problem was the British. The British had established a protectorate in that region over the so-called Mosquito people, and they claimed sovereignty to some of the land on which the Americans wanted to build, and they weren't going to give that up. So the Americans now had to negotiate with the British. Secretary of State John Clayton negotiated what would be called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which gave the Americans the right to build that canal, but also said, look, neither the British nor the Americans would occupy any part of this territory. This was all good as far as President Taylor was concerned. He sent the treaty to the Senate, saying it would secure in future the liberation of all Central America from any kind of foreign aggression. Didn't work out that way. Obviously, no canal was ever built in Nicaragua, and there were a couple of key issues. Number one, as soon as the ink was dry on the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, the Americans and the British basically had completely different interpretations of the actual words on the page, and they would bicker over this really for the next several decades. The other problem was very practical. After Zachary Taylor died, Millard Fillmore is now the president. In 1852, when they're continuing to talk about this, realized, look, Nicaragua and Costa Rica are in a conflict, they're next door neighbors, this is not a stable place. We're not going to be able to build a canal at this time. That same year, 1852, gives us a window on sort of how necessary a canal was through Central America, through the experience of a young military captain who had just recently fought in the Mexican War by the name of Ulysses Grant. Grant now was being assigned to Fort Vancouver on the West Coast, and to get there, he, along with 700 other soldiers and their families, took a boat to Panama, where they were going to cross over and then come up the Pacific Ocean to get to where he needed to go, Fort Vancouver. The problem was disease. This was, first of all, this was a horrific transportation, only 35 or 40 miles to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. They had to go through canoes and some railroads, a lot of walking, but again, it was cholera that was the real enemy here, and people were dropping one after another. Every mile it seemed like they traveled, it was more death, more burials. Not Ulysses Grant. He was okay, mainly because he didn't drink the water, and he also gave actual round-the-clock care to those around him. One of his fellow officers called Grant like a ministering angel to us all. Another called him one of the coolest men in all these trying circumstances I ever saw. Grant survived, but 250 of those travelers, more than a third of the group, perished. All 20 children on the trip perished. Look, this was not a safe thing to do, to transit by land, mainly because of disease. So the canal was still in people's minds, but it wasn't the Americans who actually took the first shot at it. It was the French under Ferdinand de Lesseps. He raised millions of dollars, hired thousands of workers, and actually began digging the canal in Panama in 1878. And it was a disaster. Once again, disease was rampant, yellow fever, malaria. About 20,000 workers died. De Lesseps ran out of money and basically cut the whole thing short. Got out of town with an unfinished canal. So in 1898, a couple of decades later, this is when the Americans really got back into this, and it was another war that prompted things. The Americans won the Spanish-American War, and in doing so, they secured more properties in the Pacific, Philippines, Guam. At the same time, they annexed Hawaii. So all the more reason, according to the President William McKinley, to bring the nation together east and west. He made the comment that the construction of such a maritime highway is now more than ever indispensable to that intimate and ready intercommunication between our eastern and western seaboards, and that our national policy imperatively more than ever calls for its control by this government. Once again, the problem? The British. That Clayton-Bulwer Treaty was still in effect effect, and they were causing problems. And the Americans actually were thinking, look, enough of this. We're just going to abrogate this treaty. But before they did that, McKinley asked his Secretary of State, John Hay, to try to negotiate a new treaty. And Hay was a good person for this, since he had recently served as the minister to Great Britain. He had good relationships there, and he did negotiate the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty. This would again concede the right of the Americans to build the canal, but there was a sticking point. The sticking point being that nobody could militarize the canal, even in war. So if the United States was in war with somebody, they could not keep out the belligerents out of the Panama Canal based on this agreement, the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty. The problem with that was the Senate balked. They said, look, this is not in our national security interest. We refuse to agree to that stipulation. They passed an amendment to take it out. This went back to the British. They declined to pursue. So what were the Americans going to do? They tried again. Secretary of State John Hay negotiated the second version of the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, and this one was better for the Americans, accomplished the needs of the Senate. It formally rescinded the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, did not forbid the United States to build fortifications along the canal route, and it did not require the canal to remain open in time of war. This is something that the Senate would pass. It was signed into law, not by McKinley. He was assassinated. The new president, Theodore Roosevelt, signed this into law November the 18th of 1901. The question for Roosevelt was where to build. Nicaragua, Panama, both had been looked at in the past, and it was actually the Panama route that Roosevelt preferred. It was a little bit longer, or rather it was a little bit shorter, but it was a little tougher from a construction standpoint because of the elevations. They had to build some dams and they had to build some locks. Nicaragua was still attractive, and it was a longer area to cover, but it was actually an easier thing to build. It was at sea level most of the way. Again, Roosevelt went back and forth, but he really settled on the Panama route. Problem here was Panama was not an independent nation. It was part of Colombia. And so the Roosevelt administration negotiated a treaty with Colombia that would give the rights to the Americans to build. The problem here was the Colombian Senate rejected that treaty, and that drew the ire of Theodore Roosevelt. He told Secretary of State Hay that they have two options. One, to take up Nicaragua, or two, in some shape or way to interfere when it becomes necessary so as to secure the Panama route without further dealing with the foolish and homicidal corruptionists in Bogota. So what did he have in mind? Well, this was spurred a little bit on a suggestion from a man named Philippe Bunau-Varilla. Bunau-Varilla had actually been the general manager for de Lesseps when he was trying to build the canal for the French. And all these years, he'd actually been continuing to try to work with the Panamanians, the Americans, to get this canal built. Well, on October 10th of 1903, he went to the White House to visit President Roosevelt and offered a suggestion. According to Bunau-Varilla, he later recalled it was then or never. I remained silent for a moment, and I pronounced the following four words in a slow, decided manner. Mr. President, a revolution. That was the idea. Panama would secede from Colombia. That would be no more barrier to building a canal. And what would President Roosevelt think about that? Would he be interested in perhaps helping out? Well, Roosevelt was a little bit coy in how he responded. According to him, he, Bunau-Varilla, had no assurances in any way, either from Hay or myself, he said. At the same time, he's a very able fellow. It was his business to find out what he thought our government would do. I have no doubt he was able to make a very accurate guess and to advise his people accordingly. So basically, with a wink and a nod, the President of the United States was supporting Bunau-Varilla's plan that would have a revolution for the Panamanians. And just to make his point that much clearer, Roosevelt sent the USS Nashville from the American Navy into the region just in case something might happen. Well, just a couple of weeks later, on November the 3rd, Panama declared its independence. Colombia rallied its troops to try to suppress this rebellion, but as soon as they saw the USS Nashville in the area, backed by the powerful US Navy, they basically turned around, went home. Panama gained its independence without a shot being fired, and 2 days later, the Americans became the first nation to recognize Panama as an independent country. Now, Roosevelt was kind of hammered in the press over this, interfering with sovereign nations like he just had, and frankly, they had a point. In fact, even his cabinet really wasn't going to defend Roosevelt over this. His Attorney General Philander, Knox, told the president, "Oh, Mr. President, do not let so great an achievement suffer from any taint of legality." His Secretary of War Elihu Root was always very blunt with his boss, and when Roosevelt asked him, "Have I answered the charges?" Root responded, "You certainly have, Mr. President. You have shown that you were accused of seduction, and you have conclusively proved that you were guilty of rape." Well, those were the words from his cabinet, but frankly, Theodore Roosevelt didn't care. As always, the end justified the means. He was going to get his canal. That's what was important. But now they still had to build the darn thing. And this, while it started almost immediately after they negotiated a treaty with Panama, there were troubles from the beginning. Logistics, engineering, manpower, and of course, disease. Roosevelt sent his new Secretary of War, William Taft, into the region, and Taft found chaos. According to Taft, such conditions of general unhealthiness prevailed as made it seem almost too much to expect that any kind of cleanup program could be made effectual. Taft rolled up his sleeves, he got to work. He established a free trade zone between the Canal Zone and Panama. That was important. He brought in the Army Corps of Engineers to replace many of the civilian engineers, got a better outcome there, constructing docks and railroads and housing just in anticipation of building the canal. But the real breakthrough came to disease. Taft brought in Colonel William Gorgas, who had been among those who had been experimenting in Cuba, trying to get rid of the disease there. And what they did was they dried out a number of the swamps, which had been breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and all of a sudden the disease began to dissipate. So Gorgas comes over at Taft's request, does the same thing in Panama, and it's basically a medical miracle. Thousands of lives would be saved. Taft, hands-on in the Panama Canal, built his entire tenure, both as Secretary of War and as President. He actually made 7 trips to the region over 7 years, keeping that thing on track. In 1906, President Roosevelt became the first president to visit a foreign nation during his presidency when he made a trip to Panama. He wanted to see things for himself. Rallied some of his troops. He told them that they were changing the face of the continent, doing the greatest engineering feat of the ages. The effect of their work will be felt while our civilization lasts. The canal would open in 1914. The president at that time is Woodrow Wilson, but there's still one last challenge for him to deal with: tolls. The previous Congress had passed the Panama Canal Act, which exempted U.S. ships that were engaged in coast-wide trade from the tolls being charged in the Panama Canal. Well, foreign governments cried foul, and the loudest? The British, of course. They were the ones who had negotiated the treaty recently with the Americans, and in that treaty it said the treaty would be built, quote, on terms of entire equality. And they're saying this is no longer on entire equality. So now it's up in operation. What would President Wilson do? Well, Wilson took a moral tone to a lot of his decision-making as President of the United States, and he felt this was no different. This was an issue of right or wrong. The U.S. had made an agreement. The U.S. ships were going to have to pay. He told his Secretary Joe Tumulty, by reason of our attitude on Panama tolls, our treaties are discredited in every chancellery of Europe. We may have made a very bad bargain with England on Panama tolls, but it will all be more credit to us if we stand by an agreement, even when it entails a sacrifice on our part. Again, honor was at stake for the United States, according to Woodrow Wilson. This was the time to do the right thing. When everything else about this administration has been forgotten, he said, its attitude on the Panama Tolls Treaty will be remembered as a long forward step in the process of making the conduct between nations the same as that which obtains between honorable individuals dealing with each other, scrupulously respecting their contracts no matter what the cost. So there were tense times with the United States and Panama throughout the next several decades around the control of the canal. Things really started to heat up during the Cold War in the 1960s. It was sort of an anti-imperialism sense about the United States. There were anti-American protests going on in Panama, and the issue of the canal and the future of who would own it and who would operate it was really front and center in the 1976 U.S. presidential election. In this case, in the Republican primary, Ronald Reagan from California is challenging the incumbent President Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination, and Reagan was very clear on where he stood on the Panama Canal. When it comes to the canal, he said, we built it, we paid for it, it's ours, and we should tell Torrijos and company that we are going to keep it. Torrijos being Omar Torrijos, the president of Panama. Well, Reagan narrowly loses to Ford, the Republican primary. Ford goes up against Jimmy Carter for the presidency. Carter wins that election in 1976, and Carter is in favor of moving forward with the treaty. And so he negotiates with the Panamanians a treaty that would actually do two things. There were actually two parts to this treaty. One was neutrality, and the United States would retain permanent right to defend the canal from any threat that might interfere with neutral service to all nations. That's treaty number one. The second being that Panama would assume full control of the canal when the clocks strike midnight, December 31st of 1999. There would be 6 months of debate about this, and for Jimmy Carter, again, moral grounds, kind of echoing Woodrow Wilson and why he was pushing so hard to get this approved, to the belief that fairness and not force should be at the heart of our dealings with the nations of the world is what Carter was telling the American people. This was going to be a close fight in the U.S. Senate to get ratification. About 6 months again of negotiating back and forth, eventually passed by 2 votes in the Senate. Both of these treaties went into effect, and sure enough, on December 31st, 1999, that last day of American control, it was transferred over to the Panamanians. Panama has been in charge of the control ever since, and here in the 21st century. Where's it going today? Is anything changing? For that, we're going to have to see. But for now, that is a look at presidents and the Panama Canal and how we got where we are today. For more on this topic, check out some of the links in the description down below on some other videos from Presidential Chronicles relevant for today's discussion. Plus, don't forget my books on Amazon.com. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.